The New York cold case, from 2001 that shocked an entire community when it was finally solved, began on a quiet morning in Bay Shore, Suffolk County. 50-year-old grandmother Edna Schubert lay dead in her neat little home on April 20th, sexually assaulted and strangled by someone who vanished without leaving a single witness behind. For 22 years, her family lived with questions that had no answers. Detectives retired. Evidence boxes gathered dust. The killer's name remained a ghost, haunting every shadow in their small town. Then in 2022, scientists used powerful genetic genealogy to build a family tree from DNA left at the scene. What they discovered sent shockwaves through Bay Shore, because the man responsible was Michael Green, someone who had walked among them, lived among them, and died among them without anyone knowing the terrible secret he carried. But how do you arrest a dead man for murder? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Officer Patricia Martinez stepped through the front door of 42 Elm Street, Bay Shore, and knew immediately that something terrible had happened here. The morning sun streamed through lace curtains, casting gentle patterns across a living room that should have been peaceful. Instead, yellow evidence markers dotted the hardwood floor like poisonous flowers. Crime scene photographers moved silently between rooms, their cameras capturing angles of violence that would haunt this house forever. Edna Schubert lay in her bedroom, a 50-year-old grandmother whose Tuesday morning had ended in unthinkable brutality. Her gray hair spread across the pillow, and her reading glasses sat neatly on the nightstand beside a bookmark protruding from a half-finished mystery novel. The irony wasn't lost on Martinez. Edna loved solving puzzles in books, but now she had become the center of a real mystery that would consume her family and community for decades to come. Outside, neighbors gathered in small clusters on sidewalks they had walked safely for years. Mrs. Chen from next door clutched her bathrobe tighter as she whispered to the mailman about hearing nothing unusual the night before. The Kowalski family from across the street stood with their arms around each other, staring at the police cars that had shattered their suburban morning quiet. Children pressed their faces against windows until their parents pulled them away, but the images of flashing lights and yellow tape would remain burned in their memories. Detective Frank Russo arrived at 10:47 a.m., his weathered face already grim as he absorbed the scene. He had worked homicide for 15 years, but something about this case felt different. Maybe it was the way Edna's house looked so normal, so safe, with its flower boxes and welcome mat. Or maybe it was how her daughter collapsed in the front yard when the news reached her, her teacher's composure cracking like ice under unbearable weight. "What do we have?" Russo asked Martinez, pulling out his notebook with practiced efficiency. "Sexual assault and strangulation," Martinez replied quietly. "No signs of forced entry, no witnesses so far. Victim lived alone since her husband died 3 years ago." Russo nodded, already forming the questions that would drive his investigation. Who knew Edna lived alone? Who had access to her house? What enemies could a grandmother possibly have in a town like Bay Shore? The answers would prove more elusive than anyone imagined that bright April morning. The Suffolk County Police Department briefing room buzzed with the controlled urgency of a major crime investigation. Detective Russo spread crime scene photographs across the conference table, while his partner, Detective Lisa Chang, posted a timeline on the whiteboard. Captain Reynolds stood at the head of the room, his expression reflecting the gravity of Bay Shore's first murder in over a decade. Edna Schubert, age 50, found deceased at approximately 9:15 this morning by her neighbor, Chang began, pointing to the victim's photograph. The neighbor, Helen Chen, became concerned when Edna didn't pick up her morning newspaper. They had coffee together every Tuesday for the past 2 years. The assembled detectives studied the evidence photos with professional detachment, but everyone in the room understood the stakes. A killer had invaded Bay Shore, violated its sense of safety, and disappeared without leaving obvious clues behind. The pressure to solve this case quickly would be enormous. "Physical evidence?" Captain Reynolds asked. "We've got DNA samples from the scene," Russo answered. "Blood, saliva, other biological material. The lab is processing everything now. Should have preliminary results within 48 hours. Detective Chang added notes to the timeline. No forced entry, but the back door was unlocked. Edna's purse wasn't touched, over $200 in cash still inside. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. If money wasn't the motive, then what was? And why target a grandmother who spent her days gardening and baking cookies for neighborhood children? "Canvassing?" Reynolds continued. "Starting this afternoon," Chang replied. "We'll hit every house within a 6-block radius. Someone had to see something. Cars that didn't belong, strangers walking around, anything unusual." Captain Reynolds studied the photos one more time, his jaw tightening. "This bastard thinks he can murder an innocent woman and walk away. We're going to prove him wrong. Every available detective is on this case until we have him in custody." Outside the briefing room windows, Bay Shore went about its daily business. but an undercurrent of fear had already begun spreading through the community. Hardware store sales of door locks and security systems would spike in the coming days. Parents would start walking their children to school instead of letting them go alone. And somewhere in the shadows, a killer watched the investigation unfold, believing he had committed the perfect crime. Detective Russo gathered the photos back into their folder, his mind already racing with possibilities. He had promised Edna's daughter they would find justice. Now he had to deliver on that promise, no matter how long it took. The door-to-door canvass began at dawn on April 21st, with teams of detectives fanning out across Bay Shore's tree-lined streets. Detective Cheng knocked on the first door of Maple Avenue, while her partner took detailed notes in a composition notebook that would become part of the case file. The routine would repeat dozens of times over the next 10 days, each conversation adding another piece to a puzzle that refused to reveal its solution. "Did you notice anything unusual Tuesday night or Wednesday morning?" Chang asked Mrs. Peterson, who lived 3 houses down from Edna. "Strange cars? People you didn't recognize? Anything out of the ordinary?" Mrs. Peterson twisted her hands nervously, clearly shaken by having police officers on her doorstep. "I wish I could help, but I didn't see anything. My husband and I went to bed around 10:30. We're early sleepers." The same story emerged from house after house. Normal bedtimes, quiet evenings, nothing unusual. The killer had either been incredibly lucky or exceptionally careful. No one remembered seeing unfamiliar vehicles parked on nearby streets. No one heard screams or sounds of struggle. Edna Schubert had died in isolation, despite living in the middle of a crowded neighborhood. Detective Martinez interviewed the mail carrier, the UPS driver, and the teenager who delivered newspapers. Each conversation revealed the same frustrating truth. Edna lived a predictable, peaceful life with few visitors and no obvious enemies. She waved to neighbors from her garden, left cookies on porches for special occasions, and never spoke ill of anyone. "She was like everybody's grandmother," explained Tom Mitchell, who lived across the street, "always asking about the kids, remembering birthdays. When my wife had surgery last year, Edna brought us casseroles twice a week until she was back on her feet." The detectives documented every detail, no matter how small. Edna's daily routine of collecting the morning paper, her Tuesday coffee dates with Helen Chen, the way she always turned on her porch light at sunset and turned it off before bed. Someone had observed these patterns closely enough to know when she would be most vulnerable. By the end of the canvass, the investigators had filled 3 notebooks with witness statements that revealed nothing useful about the killer's identity. The silence was deafening. In a neighborhood where everyone knew their neighbor's business, somehow a murderer had come and gone like smoke. Meanwhile, at the funeral home on Main Street, Edna's daughter made arrangements she never thought she would have to make. She chose a casket, while detectives continued searching for clues. She selected flowers while lab technicians processed DNA evidence. She wrote an obituary while a killer walked free somewhere in the world, believing he had gotten away with murder. The investigation was just beginning, but already the weight of unanswered questions pressed down on everyone involved. How do you catch a ghost? Street. Mary's Catholic Church had never held a funeral quite like this one. The parking lot overflowed with cars as Bay Shore residents came to pay their respects to Edna Schubert, but also to confront their own mortality in a community where murder was supposed to be impossible. The service program featured Edna's smiling face from her last Christmas photo, surrounded by quotes about eternal peace that felt fragile in the shadow of such violence. Father McKenna struggled to find words that could make sense of senseless tragedy. Edna lived a life of service, he told the packed sanctuary. She opened her heart to her neighbors, her family, and her community. That same openness should not be seen as weakness, but as the greatest strength the human spirit can possess. In the front pew, Edna's daughter sat between her teenage son and daughter, their faces reflecting different stages of grief. The son stared straight ahead with the hollow eyes of someone trying not to break down in public. The daughter clutched a tissue box and whispered prayers her grandmother had taught her. Between them, their mother accepted condolences with the mechanical politeness of shock. Detective Russo attended the service, scanning the crowd for anyone who seemed out of place. Serial killers sometimes inserted themselves into their victims' funerals, feeding off the pain they had caused. But everyone present appeared genuinely grief-stricken, from elderly neighbors who remembered Edna as a young mother to children who knew her as the lady with the best Halloween candy. The police department's official statement remained frustratingly vague. "The investigation is ongoing. We are pursuing several leads." Translation: they had no suspects and no obvious motive. The killer could be sitting in the church, or he could be 1,000 miles away by now. After the service, the funeral procession wound through streets that had become part of an active crime scene. Police cars followed discreetly behind the hearse, their presence a reminder that Bay Shore's innocents had died along with Edna. At Pinelawn Memorial Park, mourners gathered around the gravesite while helicopters from news stations circled overhead like mechanical vultures. "We will find who did this," Detective Chang promised Edna's daughter after the burial. "I know it feels hopeless right now, but we won't give up." The daughter nodded without speaking. What else could she do? Her mother was gone, killed by someone who remained a faceless shadow. The only comfort came from knowing that dedicated investigators were working around the clock to bring justice. But as the crowd dispersed and the cemetery returned to silence, questions lingered in the spring air. Would the killer strike again? Was anyone in Bayshore truly safe? And why had someone chosen to destroy such a gentle soul? The empty church pews seemed to echo with those unanswered questions, long after the last mourner had gone home. The Suffolk County Crime Lab operated 24 hours a day, but DNA analysis still moved at the pace of careful science. Technician Sarah Walsh had processed hundreds of evidence samples during her career, but the material from the Schubert case carried extra weight. Everyone knew this case would define the department's competence for years to come. Under fluorescent lights, Walsh prepared slides and ran tests with methodical precision. The biological evidence from Edna's bedroom contained a complete DNA profile, clear, uncontaminated, and perfect for database comparison. If the perpetrator had any prior arrests or convictions, CODIS would identify him within hours. The combined DNA index system represented law enforcement's most powerful tool for linking crimes and criminals across jurisdictions. Since 1998, CODIS had solved thousands of cases by matching DNA profiles from crime scenes to convicted offenders in the database. Walsh had witnessed the system's power firsthand, watching cold cases explode back to life when a name finally attached to genetic evidence. She loaded the Schubert case DNA profile into the system and initiated the search algorithm. Computer servers hummed as they compared genetic markers against millions of existing profiles. The process usually took less than an hour, but Walsh knew those 60 minutes could feel like eternity for victims' families waiting for answers. Detective Russo called every 2 hours for updates. The lab director fielded questions from the chief of police, the district attorney, and reporters who sensed the importance of fast results. Meanwhile, Walsh continued her analysis, running additional tests to confirm her findings and eliminate any possibility of error. The computer screen blinked as the search completed. No match found. Walsh stared at the result, then ran the search again. The DNA profile was excellent quality, suitable for prosecution, but the perpetrator wasn't in the system. Either he had never been arrested before, or his DNA had never been collected for inclusion in CODIS. She printed the negative result and walked it to Detective Russo's desk personally. His face fell as he read the single line that dashed their hopes for a quick resolution. "What does this mean for the investigation?" Russo asked. "We still have solid evidence for prosecution once you identify a suspect," Walsh explained. "But CODIS can't tell us who that suspect island." The detective leaned back in his chair, understanding the implications. Without a database match, they would need to solve this case through traditional detective work, interviews, surveillance, following leads wherever they might go. The DNA evidence would remain crucial, but only after they developed a suspect through other means. Outside the lab, Bayshore continued holding its breath, waiting for news that wouldn't come. The killer had struck and vanished, leaving behind perfect evidence of his crime but no clues to his identity. The evidence storage room in the Suffolk County Police Department basement looked like a library built for tragedies. Metal shelving stretched from floor to ceiling, holding cardboard boxes that contained the remnants of crimes spanning decades. Each box told a story of violence, loss, and sometimes justice. Most told stories of cases that remained frustratingly unsolved. Detective Russo carried the Schubert case materials down the narrow stairs, the evidence box surprisingly heavy for its size. Crime scene photos, witness statements, DNA reports, and autopsy findings filled folders that represented thousands of hours of investigative work. 6 months of following leads that went nowhere. 6 months of interviews that revealed nothing useful. 6 months of hoping for a breakthrough that never came. The box found its place on shelf B7, between a domestic violence case from 1999 and a robbery from 2002. A simple white label identified its contents: Schubert, eDNA, case number 2001 to 4781, homicide. The bureaucratic language couldn't capture the human cost of the crime or the frustration of the investigators who had exhausted every avenue. Captain Reynolds had made the decision to classify the case as inactive, though he avoided using the word cold. Inactive implied temporary suspension, a pause rather than surrender. Cold suggested permanence, acceptance that some mysteries would never be solved. The distinction mattered to everyone who had worked on the investigation. "We'll revisit this every 6 months," Reynolds assured Detective Russo. New technology, fresh eyes, maybe someone will talk who wouldn't talk before. This isn't over, but Russo knew the statistics. After 6 months without an arrest, homicide cases became exponentially harder to solve. Witnesses forgot details, evidence degraded, and other crimes demanded attention. The Schubert case would join hundreds of others waiting patiently in the basement, hoping for resurrection that might never come. Upstairs in the squad room, detectives were already working new cases. Bayshore had returned to its normal rhythm of minor crimes and traffic violations. Edna's murder had become yesterday's tragedy, replaced by today's urgent problems. Only her family remained trapped in April 20, 2001, unable to move forward without answers. The evidence box settled into its new home, with a small thud that echoed through the storage room. Somewhere in the darkness between those cardboard walls lay the genetic fingerprint of a killer, waiting for science to catch up with. Justice. The DNA profile sat perfect and untouchable, like a locked door that no one yet possessed the key to open. Years would pass before anyone disturbed the dust on that particular box. But the truth it contained would never fade, never decay, never lose its power to name a killer when the right moment finally arrived. Time moved differently for families of murder victims. While Bayshore gradually returned to normal life, Edna's daughter remained suspended in the amber of grief and unanswered questions. Calendar pages turned from spring to summer, to fall to winter, marking anniversaries of pain rather than progress. The first Christmas, without her mother. The first Mother's Day. The first birthday when no one called to sing the traditional family song. Each April 20th brought renewed media attention and police assurances that the case remained a priority. Local newspapers ran anniversary articles with headlines like, "1 year later, still no answers in Schubert murder, and Bayshore grandmother's killer remains free." Television news crews would set up cameras outside the house on Elm Street, interviewing neighbors who had long since stopped looking over their shoulders when they walked to their mailboxes. Detective Chang, promoted to sergeant, made annual courtesy calls to update the family on the lack of progress. "We haven't forgotten," she would promise, sitting in the same living room where condolence flowers once filled every surface. "Technology keeps improving. Something might break." The daughter nodded politely during these conversations, but hope had calcified into resignation. She had returned to teaching 3rd grade at Bayshore Elementary, finding purpose in nurturing other people's children while trying to make sense of a world where grandmothers could be murdered in their own bedrooms. Her students occasionally asked why Mrs. Patterson looked sad, prompting careful explanations about loss and healing. In 2003, a serial killer was arrested in Nassau County, sparking brief excitement that he might be connected to Edna's case. DNA testing ruled out any link. In 2005, a sex offender from Patchogue was investigated after committing similar crimes. Again, no connection. Each false hope felt like losing her mother all over again. The house on Elm Street changed hands twice during those years. Neither family stayed long, whether from lingering unease about the murder or simply the normal patterns of suburban life. The new owners painted the walls and replaced the carpets, but somehow the address retained its reputation as the place where Bayshore's innocence died. Detective Russo retired in 2007, handing off his cases to younger investigators, who brought fresh energy but no new insights. At his farewell party, he pulled Edna's daughter aside and apologized for not solving her mother's murder. "Some cases haunt you forever," he admitted. "This is one of mine." The evidence box in the basement gathered dust, occasionally disturbed when new detectives reviewed old files, looking for missed connections or overlooked clues. Each review ended the same way, with reluctant acknowledgement that every reasonable investigative avenue had been explored. By 2010, Edna Schubert had become a statistic, one of thousands of unsolved homicides in New York State. Her case file contained hundreds of pages documenting meticulous police work, but it lacked the only page that mattered: an arrest report naming her killer. The cold case unit occupied a cramped office on the 3rd floor of Suffolk County Police Headquarters, staffed by detectives who specialized in breathing life into forgotten investigations. Detective Maria Santos joined the unit in 2010 with a reputation for persistence and an intuitive understanding of how crimes connected across time and geography. Old cases didn't intimidate her, they challenged her. The Schubert file landed on her desk during her first week, part of a routine review of inactive homicides. Santos opened the evidence box like an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts, studying crime scene photos and witness statements that had been analyzed dozens of times by previous investigators. Sometimes fresh eyes could spot patterns that familiarity had obscured. She spread everything across her desk: autopsy reports, DNA analysis, interview transcripts, surveillance footage from nearby businesses. The killer's genetic profile stared up at her from the laboratory report, as clear and usable as the day it was processed. Somewhere in the world, those chromosomes existed in a living person who had walked away from murder and continued his life as if nothing had happened. "What do you think?" asked Detective Kevin Walsh, Santos's partner, and a 20-year veteran of cold case work. "The DNA is solid," Santos replied, studying the forensic analysis. "No degradation, no contamination issues. If we ever get a suspect, prosecution will be straightforward." Walsh nodded. The original investigators were thorough. They interviewed everyone, followed every lead, processed the scene correctly. Sometimes you inherit a case where corners were cut, but not this one. Santos began creating a timeline on the whiteboard, marking key dates and developments. The murder on April 20, 2001, the negative CODIS search, the gradual shift from active to inactive status. Each milestone represented months or years of frustration for Edna's family and the officers who had worked the case. Technology continued evolving during those years. DNA analysis became more sensitive, capable of developing profiles from smaller and more degraded samples. Database searches became more sophisticated, cross-referencing not just convicted offenders but missing persons, unidentified remains, and evidence from other unsolved crimes. None of these advances helped the Schubert case because the quality of the original evidence had never been the problem. Santos made a note to run the DNA profile through CODIS again, even though the chances of a hit remained minimal. She would also research similar crimes in neighboring jurisdictions, looking for patterns that might indicate a serial offender. Most importantly, she would re-interview key witnesses to see if time had loosened any memories or encouraged anyone to share information they had previously withheld. The cold case unit solved an average of 3 cases per year, usually through new DNA technology, witnesses who finally came forward, or criminals who confessed to old crimes while being prosecuted for new ones. Santos hoped the Schubert case would become number 4 in 2010, though she understood that hope was a luxury investigators couldn't afford to lose. The decision to submit the Schubert case DNA to the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center's Genetic Genealogy program came during a cold case unit meeting in February 2022. Detective Santos, now a veteran of unsolved homicides, had watched technology transform criminal investigations throughout her career. CODIS searches had expanded to include millions of profiles. Forensic DNA analysis had become more sophisticated and sensitive, but some cases stubbornly resisted solution, despite every technological advance. "Genetic genealogy is different," explained Lieutenant Rodriguez, the unit commander. "Instead of just comparing our suspects' DNA to convicted criminals, we can build family trees from genetic material and work backward to identify possible suspects." The process had gained national attention by solving high-profile cold cases like the Golden State Killer investigation in California. Public genealogy databases contained DNA information from millions of people who had submitted samples to trace their ancestry. When law enforcement uploaded crime scene DNA to these systems, genetic matches with distant relatives could provide investigative leads that traditional methods never revealed. Santos pulled the Schubert file from her desk drawer, where it had lived for over a decade. The case had become personal to her, representing every victim whose killer had escaped justice. She thought about Edna's daughter, now in her 60s, who still called the police department every few months hoping for news that never came. "What are the chances of success?" Santos asked. "Depends on several factors," Rodriguez replied. "Quality of the DNA sample, size of the suspect's family tree, whether his relatives have submitted genetic information to public databases. Some cases solve within weeks. Others never develop usable leads." The genetic genealogy program represented the cutting edge of forensic science, but it required patience and expertise. Analysts would need months to build comprehensive family trees, identify potential suspects, and eliminate false matches. The process demanded the same methodical approach that had characterized the original investigation, but with tools that hadn't existed in 2001. Santos filled out the application paperwork carefully, documenting the evidence chain and confirming the DNA sample's integrity. After 21 years, Edna Schubert's case was about to get one more chance at resolution. The package containing DNA evidence traveled from Suffolk County to Albany in a temperature-controlled vehicle, carrying genetic secrets that had waited 2 decades for the right technology to unlock them. Inside that sealed vial lay the molecular fingerprint of a killer, about to encounter the most sophisticated investigative techniques ever developed. At the State Police Laboratory, forensic geneticists prepared to embark on a journey through genetic data that would lead them backward through generations of family history. Somewhere in that vast genealogical maze, A name waited to be discovered. A name that would finally give Edna Schubert's family the answers they had sought for over 20 years. The New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center in Albany hummed with the quiet intensity of scientific precision. Forensic geneticist Dr. Jennifer Park had processed dozens of cold cases through genetic genealogy analysis, but each new submission brought the possibility of breakthrough. The Schubert case DNA arrived with a note from Detective Santos. This family has waited 21 years for answers. Dr. Park began by confirming the sample's quality and completeness. The DNA profile contained sufficient genetic markers for genealogical analysis, a critical first step in a process that could take months to complete. Under her microscope, those molecular structures represented the only physical connection between a victim and her killer, preserved by careful evidence handling and advancing forensic science. The first phase involved uploading the DNA profile to public genealogy databases and searching for genetic matches. Unlike CODIS, which compared DNA to convicted criminals, these databases contained genetic information from ordinary people researching their family histories. Distant cousins, great-aunts, and other relatives could provide the genealogical threads needed to weave a family tree around an unknown suspect. The computer algorithms identified several potential genetic matches within the first week. None were close relatives, no parents, siblings, or children, but third and fourth cousins provided enough genetic overlap to suggest family connections. Dr. Park began building family trees for each match, working backward through generations of births, marriages, and deaths recorded in public records. Her colleague, genealogist Thomas Chen, specialized in interpreting the complex relationships revealed by genetic analysis. "We're looking for common ancestors," he explained to Dr. Park as they studied their first family tree diagram. "If multiple genetic matches trace back to the same great-great-grandparents, our suspect probably descends from that couple too." The process resembled detective work more than traditional laboratory analysis. Chen searched through census records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and military service documents, building biographical profiles of potential suspects' ancestors. Each name added to the family tree brought them closer to identifying the specific branch that contained their target. Weeks passed as the tree grew more complex and comprehensive. The suspect appeared to have Irish and Italian ancestry, with family roots in Brooklyn dating back to the early 1900s. Several branches of the tree had moved to Long Island by the 1952, placing potential suspects in the right geographic area during 2001. Dr. Park maintained careful documentation of their analysis, knowing that any eventual prosecution would require detailed explanations of their methodology. Genetic genealogy had proven itself in court, but the science was complex enough to challenge judges and juries unfamiliar with the technology. By summer 2022, the family tree contained over 200 names spanning 5 generations. Somewhere in that genealogical maze lived the answer to a 21-year-old question. The scientists were getting closer to that answer with each new branch they constructed. The breakthrough came on a humid Thursday morning in July 2022. Genealogist Thomas Chen had been methodically eliminating potential suspects from the family tree when one name stopped him cold. Michael Green, age 47, at the time of Edna Schubert's murder, living in Bayport just 10 miles from Bay Shore. The genetic evidence suggested Green descended from the same Irish immigrant family as several database matches. Chen immediately pulled up public records for Michael Green. Born in 1954 inches Brooklyn, moved to Suffolk County in the 1982, worked sporadically in construction and landscaping, divorced in 1998, no children. Most significantly, he had died in 2019 from liver cancer, which explained why his DNA had never appeared in CODIS through criminal arrest. "Dr. Park, you need to see this," Chen called across the laboratory. Dr. Park studied the family tree diagram, following the genetic connections that led to Michael Green. The genealogical analysis placed him in the right location at the right time, but they needed additional confirmation before contacting law enforcement. Genetic genealogy provided investigative leads, not definitive proof of guilt. "Do we have any information about his lifestyle, his behavior patterns?" Dr. Park asked. Chen continued searching through public records and online archives. Michael Green had lived a largely solitary life, working temporary jobs and renting small apartments. He had no significant criminal record beyond minor traffic violations. From a distance, he appeared to be exactly the kind of person who could commit a terrible crime and fade back into invisibility. His ex-wife might still be alive, Chen noted, finding divorce records from Suffolk County Family Court. Linda Green, maiden name Morrison, last known address in Ronkonkoma. Dr. Park made careful notes about Michael Green's background while continuing to verify the genetic connections. The science was solid. The DNA evidence from Edna Schubert's bedroom shared genetic markers with multiple members of Green's extended family tree. But they would need additional confirmation before officially naming him as a suspect. What about other family members? Anyone who might provide DNA for comparison? Chen located two of Green's first cousins still living on Long Island. Both had submitted genetic samples to ancestry databases, which provided the initial matches that led to Green's identification. If law enforcement could collect additional DNA from Green's closer relatives, they could strengthen the genetic case considerably. The family tree that had consumed months of painstaking analysis was finally yielding results. At the center of that genealogical web sat Michael Green, a man who had lived his entire adult life carrying the secret of what he had done to Edna Schubert. He had died believing that secret was safe, never imagining that science would eventually follow genetic breadcrumbs back to his door. Dr. Park prepared her preliminary report for Suffolk County Police, knowing it would change everything for a family that had waited 21 years for this moment. Detective Santos felt her pulse quicken as she read the genetic genealogy report. After 11 years of working cold cases, she had learned to manage expectations, but the scientific analysis of Michael Green looked compelling. The genealogical connections were solid, his geographic location fit perfectly, and his death in 2019 explained why the DNA had never matched in CODIS searches. "We need to verify this independently," Santos told her partner, Detective Walsh. "Genetic genealogy gives us a lead, but we still need definitive proof." The investigation now focused on collecting DNA samples from Michael Green's living relatives for direct comparison to the crime scene evidence. This required delicate diplomacy, approaching family members who had no idea their deceased relative was suspected of murder, asking them to voluntarily provide genetic material for testing. Santos and Walsh drove to Ronkonkoma to interview Linda Green, Michael's ex-wife, at her small apartment near the railroad tracks. Linda agreed to speak with them, though she appeared nervous about why police were asking questions about her former husband 2 years after his death. "Michael was a troubled man," Linda explained, sitting at her kitchen table. "He drank too much, couldn't keep jobs, had a temper that scared me sometimes, but I never thought he could hurt anyone else." The detectives explained that Michael was being investigated in connection with an unsolved crime, but they couldn't provide specific details while the investigation remained active. Linda signed a consent form allowing them to collect her DNA through a simple cheek swab, hoping to eliminate any confusion about her ex-husband's activities. "If Michael did something terrible, I want to know," she said quietly. "I've spent years wondering what went wrong with him, why he became so angry and withdrawn. Maybe this will finally provide some answers." Next, the detectives visited Michael's first cousin, Robert Green, who lived in Patchogue and worked as a mechanic. Robert had submitted DNA to a genealogy website to trace his Irish ancestry, never imagining the information would be used in a criminal investigation. "My cousin Mike was always a loner," Robert told the detectives. "Even as kids, he kept to himself, didn't really fit in with the family. After his divorce, I hardly saw him except at funerals." Robert also provided a voluntary DNA sample, understanding that the genetic evidence could either clear his cousin's name or confirm his involvement in something horrible. The family wanted answers as much as law enforcement did. Within 48 hours, both DNA samples were processed at the state police laboratory. The results were unambiguous. Michael Green was the source of the biological evidence found at Edna Schubert's crime scene. After 21 years, the genetic fingerprint finally had a name attached. Detective Santos stared at the confirmation report, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. They had solved the case, but the killer was beyond the reach of earthly justice. The laboratory confirmation hit Detective Santos like a physical blow. After 21 years of mystery, the DNA evidence conclusively identified Michael Green as Edna Schubert's killer. The genetic match was so definitive that it could have supported prosecution beyond any reasonable doubt if Green were still alive to face charges. Dr. Jennifer Park's final report contained irrefutable scientific evidence. The probability that someone other than Michael Green had left biological material at the crime scene was approximately 1 in 7.8 billion. The genetic genealogy analysis was correct, the family tree construction was accurate, and the DNA comparison was flawless. "So what happens now?" Detective Walsh asked, reading the report for the third time. "We close the case," Santos replied, though the words felt hollow. "Green is dead. We can't arrest him, prosecute him, or make him answer for what he did." The implications weighed heavily on both detectives. They had done everything right, preserved evidence, followed scientific protocols, used cutting-edge technology to identify the perpetrator. But justice in its traditional form remained impossible because the killer had died of natural causes while his crime went undetected. Santos began preparing the case closure documentation, knowing that paperwork could never capture the full scope of what they had accomplished. The Schubert family would finally have answers, though those answers came with the bitter knowledge that their mother's killer had lived freely for 18 years after murdering her. The investigation file now contained Michael Green's complete background, compiled through public records and interviews with people who had known him. He had been a construction worker and landscaper, who lived alone, struggled with alcoholism, and had difficulty maintaining long-term employment. Nothing in his history suggested violence, but that was often true of killers who committed isolated crimes. Do we know if he killed anyone else? Walsh wondered. Santos had already begun researching other unsolved cases from Green's areas of residence. The investigation would continue even after his death, searching for additional victims who might finally receive justice through genetic identification. Sex offenders and killers sometimes committed multiple crimes across different jurisdictions, and Green's DNA profile would be compared to evidence from other cold cases. The laboratory report sat on Santos's desk, like a monument to perseverance. 21 years of uncertainty had led to this moment of scientific certainty. Michael Green could never be held accountable in a courtroom, but his name would forever be linked to the murder of Edna Schubert. Sometimes that was the best justice the system could provide. Tomorrow, Santos would drive to Bay Shore to personally deliver the news to Edna's daughter. After more than 2 decades of unanswered questions, a family would finally know the truth about who had stolen their grandmother, mother, and friend from the world. Detective Santos had made thousands of notifications during her career, but nothing prepared her for the conversation she needed to have with Edna Schubert's daughter. She parked outside the modest house where the victim's family had rebuilt their lives around an unsolvable puzzle, knowing that the next few minutes would fundamentally change their relationship with grief and loss. The daughter, now 61 years old, opened the front door with the wariness of someone who had received too many disappointing updates over the years. Her face showed the accumulated weight of 21 years spent wondering whether her mother's killer was still alive, still free, still capable of hurting other families. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Detective Santos from the Cold Case Unit. We have some important information about your mother's case." They sat in the same living room where dozens of previous conversations had taken place, but this time was different. Santos opened her folder and placed Michael Green's photograph on the coffee table, a driver's license photo, showing a middle-aged man with thinning hair and tired eyes. "We've identified the person responsible for your mother's death," Santos began carefully. His name was Michael Green. He lived in the area in 2001, and DNA evidence confirms his involvement in the crime. The daughter stared at the photograph, studying the face of the man who had destroyed her family's sense of safety and security. He looked ordinary, unremarkable, like someone she might have passed in the grocery store without a second glance. "Was?" she asked, noting the past tense. "Mr. Green died in 2019 from liver cancer," Santos explained. "He was never arrested or charged in connection with your mother's case because we weren't able to identify him until now." The news hit with complicated force. Relief at finally having answers mixed with frustration that traditional justice would remain impossible. The killer had escaped earthly punishment, dying peacefully, while his victim's family continued to suffer his actions. "Did you know my mother?" the daughter asked, still studying Green's photograph. "We don't believe so," Santos replied. "The evidence suggests this was a random crime. Your mother was simply in the wrong place when a dangerous person decided to act on violent impulses." They talked for over an hour about the investigation, the genetic genealogy process, and what the identification meant for the case's official status. The daughter asked thoughtful questions about Green's background, trying to understand what had motivated such terrible violence against an innocent woman. "Thank you," she whispered as Detective Santos prepared to leave. "I know this doesn't bring her back, but knowing the truth helps somehow. After all these years, we finally know." Outside, Santos sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine. She had delivered the best possible news under impossible circumstances. The case was solved, but justice remained incomplete. The news of Michael Green's identification spread through Bay Shore, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Detective Santos had prepared a carefully worded press release that balanced the need for public information with respect for the victim's family and the limitations of posthumous identification. Local television stations led their evening broadcasts with the story that many residents had given up hope of ever hearing. After 22 years, Suffolk County Police have identified the person responsible for the murder of Bay Shore grandmother Edna Schubert, announced Channel 7's crime reporter, standing outside the house on Elm Street where the crime had occurred. Michael Green, who died in 2019, was identified through advanced genetic genealogy techniques. The revelation shocked neighbors who remembered the fear and suspicion that had gripped their community in 2001. Michael Green's name was unfamiliar to most Bayshore residents, though a few recalled seeing him working landscaping jobs in the area during that time period. He had been invisible, anonymous, exactly the kind of person who could commit murder and disappear back into ordinary life. At Bailey's hardware store on Main Street, owner Tom Bailey fielded questions from customers who remembered the panic buying of locks and security systems that followed Edna's murder. Nobody suspected him specifically, Bailey told a reporter. He was just another guy doing yard work, trying to make a living. Shows you never really know who's living among you. The house where Edna died had changed hands several times since 2001, but current residents still felt connected to the tragedy that had defined their address. "It's a relief to finally know," said Margaret Chen, who had purchased the property in 2018. Not knowing who killed her made it feel like the danger was still out there somewhere. Social media buzzed with reactions from Bayshore residents, sharing memories of the crime and their relief at its resolution. Many expressed frustration that Green had died without facing trial, but most seemed grateful that the mystery had finally ended. The genetic genealogy breakthrough offered hope that other cold cases might be solved using similar techniques. At St. Mary's Catholic Church, Father McKenna prepared to hold a memorial service for Edna, acknowledging that the identification of her killer provided a form of closure the community hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. "We may never understand why evil visited our neighborhood that morning," he planned to say, "but we can take comfort in knowing that truth has finally prevailed." The flowers appeared on Edna's old porch within hours of the news breaking. Neighbors who had carried questions for 22 years finally had answers, and they expressed their relief through small gestures of remembrance. Yellow daisies, white roses, and handwritten notes accumulated throughout the day, transforming a crime scene back into a place of memory and love. Bayshore could finally exhale the breath it had been holding since April 20, 2001. The press conference room at Suffolk County Police Headquarters, filled with reporters, cameras, and officials who had waited over 2 decades to announce the resolution of Bayshore's most notorious unsolved crime. Detective Santos sat at the long table beside Lieutenant Rodriguez and District Attorney Patricia Walsh, feeling the weight of 22 years of investigation culminating in this moment of public accountability. Chief of Police Robert Martinez opened with prepared remarks acknowledging the persistence of investigators and the breakthrough potential of genetic genealogy technology. "Today we can provide the answers that Edna Schubert's family and the Bayshore community have sought since April 20, 2001. Lieutenant Rodriguez presented the technical details of the investigation, explaining how advanced DNA analysis and genealogical research had identified Michael Green as the perpetrator. He emphasized the scientific certainty of the genetic match, while acknowledging the frustration that traditional prosecution would remain impossible. "The DNA evidence is conclusive," Rodriguez explained to the assembled media. "Michael Green committed this crime, and we can prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. Unfortunately, he died in 2019, so there will be no arrest and no trial." District Attorney Walsh addressed the legal implications of identifying a deceased suspect. While Green could not be prosecuted, the case would be officially closed, providing resolution for the victim's family and the community. She praised the persistence of investigators who never gave up on finding answers. Detective Santos spoke last, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "This case has been a priority for Suffolk County Police for 22 years. We promised Edna's family we would find her killer, and today we keep that promise." In the front row, Edna's daughter sat with her adult children, clutching a tissue as she listened to officials describe the man who had murdered her mother. She had waited over half her adult life for this moment, and the mixed emotions showed clearly on her face: relief at finally having answers, sadness that justice remained incomplete. During the question and answer session, reporters asked about Green's background, whether he was suspected in other crimes, and what the identification meant for similar cold cases. Detective Santos answered carefully, balancing public interest with ongoing investigations that might connect Green to additional crimes. "We are reviewing other unsolved cases from areas where Michael Green lived and worked," she confirmed. "This investigation may help solve additional crimes and bring closure to other families." The press conference concluded with Chief Martinez reading a statement from Edna's family. "While nothing can bring our mother and grandmother back, knowing the truth about who killed her provides peace we have sought for 22 years. We thank the dedicated investigators who never forgot about Edna." As cameras recorded those final words, everyone in the room understood they had witnessed a rare moment when persistence and science converged to deliver justice, even if that justice came too late for traditional legal resolution. Street, Mary's Catholic Church had hosted many memorial services over the decades, but the vigil for Edna Schubert felt different from any that came before. The revelation of Michael Green's identity had transformed grief that had seemed permanent into something more complex, a mixture of closure, relief, and lingering sadness for justice that could never be complete. Father McKenna stood before the altar where he had delivered Edna's eulogy 22 years earlier, addressing many of the same faces that had gathered in 2001 to mourn her death. But tonight, they came not just to remember a victim, but to acknowledge the end of a mystery that had haunted their community for over 2 decades. We gather tonight not in the shadow of unanswered questions, but in the light of truth finally revealed. Father McKenna began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary. Edna's killer has been named, and while earthly justice remains beyond our reach, we can find peace in knowing that God's justice is eternal and complete. Candles flickered throughout the church, as residents who had lived with fear and uncertainty for years finally found the courage to release those burdens. Margaret O'Brien, who had been Edna's neighbor in 2001, wept quietly as she lit a votive candle near the altar. "I used to check my locks 3 times every night," she whispered to her daughter. "Maybe tonight I can finally sleep without being afraid." Edna's daughter rose to address the congregation, her voice trembling with emotion but growing stronger as she spoke. "My mother would have been amazed by all of you by how you never forgot her, never stopped caring about what happened to her. She always believed that good people would eventually triumph over evil, and she was right." The service included prayers for Edna's soul and for the healing of a community that had been wounded by violence. But it also offered thanksgiving for the investigators, scientists, and technology that had finally provided answers to questions that once seemed unanswerable. Detective Santos attended the vigil, sitting quietly in a back pew as she watched the community process the end of their longest nightmare. Cold case work often felt abstract, focused on evidence and forensics, rather than the human cost of unsolved crimes. But moments like this reminded her why the work mattered so profoundly. As the service concluded, congregation members formed a circle around the altar, joining hands as they sang "Amazing Grace" in voices that carried both sorrow and hope. The melody rose through the church like incense, carrying with it the prayers of people who had finally found peace after carrying fear for 22 years. Outside, Bay Shore's streets looked exactly as they had for decades. But the community that walked those sidewalks had been fundamentally changed. They were no longer a town living in the shadow of an unsolved murder, but neighbors who had witnessed truth's ultimate victory over darkness. The photo albums had been stored in the attic for years, too painful to look through but too precious to discard. Now, 3 weeks after learning Michael Green's name, Edna's daughter climbed the narrow stairs to retrieve the memories she had been avoiding. Dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight as she opened boxes that contained a lifetime of family celebrations, holidays, and ordinary moments made precious by loss. She settled on the living room carpet with albums spread around her like a paper quilt. Here was her mother at age 25, holding her newborn daughter with the confident smile of a young mother, convinced the world was safe and good. There she was at 50, surrounded by grandchildren at Christmas morning, wearing the red sweater that would become evidence in a criminal investigation just 4 months later. Each photograph told a story that Michael Green's violence had tried to end, but the pictures proved stronger than death. Edna blowing out birthday candles, Edna teaching her grandson to plant tomatoes, Edna laughing at some forgotten joke, while flour dusted her apron during holiday baking. These were the memories that defined her life, not the terrible morning when it ended. The daughter found herself smiling at images she hadn't been able to face for years. Her mother's expression in a photo from a family barbecue in 2000, pure contentment, as she watched her children and grandchildren playing in the backyard. The way Edna's eyes crinkled when she laughed, a trait that had passed down through generations of women in their family. She was happy, the daughter whispered to herself, realizing this truth for the first time since 2001. Her mother had lived a good life, filled with love and purpose and joy. Michael Green had stolen Edna's remaining years, but he couldn't steal the 50 years of memories contained in these albums. There was a photo from Easter 2001, just 3 weeks before the murder. Edna wore her best dress and held her youngest granddaughter, both of them squinting slightly in the bright spring sunshine. The daughter had avoided this particular picture for 22 years because it was the last family photograph ever taken of her mother alive. Now she studied it with different eyes, seeing not an ending but a celebration of life lived fully. She pulled out her phone and called her own daughter, now grown with children of her own. "I'm looking through Grandma's photo albums," she said when her daughter answered. "Would you like to come over? I think it's time the kids learned more stories about their great-grandmother." As she waited for her family to arrive, the daughter continued turning pages. remembering birthdays and vacations and quiet Sunday afternoons that had seemed ordinary at the time but now felt like treasures. Michael Green had taken her mother's life, but he hadn't taken her mother's legacy. That lived on in every photograph, every story, every trait that passed from grandmother to daughter to granddaughter. The albums would return to their place on the bookshelf, but this time they would be visited regularly, rather than hidden away. Edna deserved to be remembered for how she lived, not just how she died. The cold case unit office felt different the morning Detective Santos returned Michael Green's file to the archive room. After 11 years of keeping the Schubert case on her active desk, the empty space seemed to echo with finality. She carried the expanded folder now thick with genealogy reports, family tree diagrams, and DNA confirmations down to the basement storage area where solved cases found their final rest. The metal shelving that housed Bay Shore's longest-running mystery had been reorganized since 2001. Hundreds of cases had come and gone, some solved through traditional detective work, others through advancing forensic technology. A few remained stubbornly unsolved, waiting for their own breakthrough moments. The Schubert file would take its place among the victories, proof that persistence and science could triumph over time and death. Detective Walsh helped Santos carry the evidence boxes, both investigators understanding the significance of this moment. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Walsh commented as they found the case's new home on the solved shelf. "We worked this thing for over a decade," Santos nodded, running her hand along the box's edge before sliding it into position. "But we did it. We kept the promise we made to her family." The case closure report sat on Lieutenant Rodriguez's desk, awaiting final signatures that would officially end Suffolk County's longest-running homicide investigation. The paperwork documented 22 years of police work, from the initial crime scene processing through the genealogy breakthrough that identified Michael Green as the killer. Other detectives in the unit understood that the Schubert case represented something special, a reminder that no case was ever truly hopeless. No family's quest for answers was ever forgotten. The success would inspire continued work on other cold cases, proof that advancing technology could reach across decades to deliver justice. "What's next?" Walsh asked as they returned to their desks. Santos pulled a different file folder from her cabinet, one containing photographs and evidence from a 1987 murder in Islip. Helen Kowalski, age 34, found strangled in her apartment. Original investigators collected DNA, but CODIS came up empty. "Maybe it's time to try genealogy on this one too." The work continued, as it always would. For every case like Edna Schubert's that found resolution, another family waited for answers to questions that haunted their nights and shaped their days. The cold case unit existed to serve those families, to ensure that time and bureaucracy never erased the human cost of unsolved crimes. Santos opened the Kowalski file and began reading, already forming theories and investigative strategies. Somewhere in those pages lay another mystery waiting to be solved, another family deserving of truth after decades of uncertainty. On the evidence box's white label, someone had written "closed" in red ink next to Edna Schubert's name. It was a small notation that represented an enormous victory for science, persistence, and the belief that justice, however delayed, would eventually prevail. Summer brought healing conversations to Bay Shore's sidewalks and front porches, as neighbors who had carried whispered fears for over 2 decades finally felt safe enough to speak openly about the terror that had once gripped their community. The revelation of Michael Green's identity had broken a spell of silence that had lasted 22 years, allowing people to process trauma they hadn't even realized they were carrying. Margaret Chen and Dorothy Kowalski met for their first honest conversation about April 20, 2001, sitting on Margaret's front steps while their grandchildren played in the yard. Both women lived within 3 blocks of where Edna had died, and both had struggled with anxiety and hypervigilance that they had never connected to that terrible morning. "I stopped walking alone after dark," Margaret admitted, watching her granddaughter chase butterflies in the garden. "Even going to the mailbox at night made me nervous. I thought I was just getting older and more cautious." Dorothy nodded knowingly. "I made my husband check all the doors and windows every night before bed. He thought I was being silly, but I couldn't sleep unless I knew everything was locked tight. Now I realize I wasn't being paranoid, I was being realistic." They talked about the subtle changes that had crept into their daily routines, without conscious acknowledgement. Extra attention to unusual cars parked in the neighborhood, reluctance to answer the door for strangers. A general sense of unease that had become so normalized they forgot Bay Shore had once felt completely safe. "The worst part was not knowing," Margaret continued. "Was it someone random passing through, or was it someone we knew, someone we saw at the grocery store or the post office? That uncertainty made everyone feel suspicious. The identification of Michael Green as an outsider, someone who worked occasionally in the area but wasn't part of the community, had allowed neighbors to release suspicions they had carried about each other. The mailman who had seemed nervous after the murder, the handyman who had worked on several houses that spring, the divorced father who kept to himself and rarely spoke to other parents at school events. "I feel bad about doubting people," Dorothy confessed, "but when you don't know who the killer is, everyone becomes a potential threat." Children playing in the yard represented a generation that had grown up under the shadow of Edna's unsolved murder, without understanding why their parents were so protective, why they weren't allowed to walk to school alone, why strangers at the door were met with such wariness. Those children were now adults with children of their own, perpetuating cycles of caution born from unresolved trauma. As evening approached, Margaret and Dorothy embraced before going their separate ways, a gesture of friendship that acknowledged shared survival and mutual healing. For the first time in over 2 decades, Bayshore's neighbors were rediscovering what it meant to trust their community and each other. The summer air carried sounds of normal suburban life: lawnmowers, children laughing, screen doors closing gently in the gathering dusk. It was the sound of a neighborhood finally learning to breathe freely again. The cemetery visit had become a monthly ritual, but this October afternoon felt different from all the others. Edna's daughter knelt beside the granite headstone, where her mother had rested for 22 years, carrying news she had dreamed of sharing for over 2 decades. The autumn leaves created a carpet of gold and crimson around the grave, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the peaceful hillside. "We found him, Mom," she whispered, placing a bouquet of yellow mums, Edna's favorite flowers, against the headstone. "His name was Michael Green. The police say the DNA proves he killed you, so there's no doubt anymore." The words felt strange after so many years of questions without answers. She had imagined this conversation countless times, wondering how she would feel when the mystery finally ended. Relief was there, but also sadness that justice in its traditional form would remain forever incomplete. "I wish you could have seen how many people worked to find him," she continued, settling more comfortably on the grass. "Detectives who never gave up, scientists who used new technology we couldn't even imagine in 2001. The whole police department kept their promise to you." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves around them, and for a moment, the daughter felt her mother's presence, as strongly as she had when Edna was alive. Not the violent image that had haunted her nightmares for so long, but the warm, loving woman who had raised her to be strong in the face of life's challenges. "I'm not angry anymore," she realized, surprised by the truth of those words. "I was so furious for so long at him, at God, at the world for taking you away from us. But knowing who he was, knowing he's dead and can't hurt anyone else, that anger is just gone." She told her mother about the grandchildren who barely remembered her but carried her traits in their smiles and their kindness to others. About holidays that had slowly become celebrations again, instead of reminders of absence. About the way the family had learned to honor Edna's memory by living the generous, loving lives she had taught them to value. "The house where you died isn't scary anymore," she added. "They're going to put up a small memorial garden there, something beautiful to remember all the good things about your life, the way you made everyone feel welcome, the way you always helped people who needed it." As the sun began to set, she prepared to leave, but not with the heavy heart that usually accompanied these visits. Tonight she felt something she hadn't experienced since 2001, genuine peace about her mother's death and its aftermath. "We're okay now, Mom," she whispered, pressing her palm against the cool granite. "We're going to be okay." The words echoed across the cemetery like a promise finally kept, carrying with them the weight of 22 years of grief, transformed into something lighter, something manageable, something that honored love rather than loss. The public library's community room had been transformed into a temporary exhibit space, featuring displays about cold cases solved through genetic genealogy and other advancing forensic technologies. Edna Schubert's story occupied a place of honor near the entrance, her smiling photograph surrounded by information about how science had finally provided answers her family had sought for over 2 decades. Children pressed their faces against the display cases, while their parents read accounts of investigations that had seemed hopeless, until breakthrough moments changed everything. The exhibit was designed to educate the public about forensic science, while honoring victims whose cases had been resolved through persistence and technological innovation. Genetic genealogy represents the future of criminal investigation, read one placard beside a simplified diagram of DNA analysis. By comparing crime scene evidence to public genealogy databases, scientists can build family trees that lead investigators to suspects who might otherwise never be identified. Edna's case served as the centerpiece example, showing how evidence collected in 2001 had waited patiently for technology that didn't exist until 2022. Visitors could follow the investigation timeline from the initial crime scene through the genetic genealogy breakthrough that identified Michael Green as her killer. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, studied Edna's photograph with intense concentration. Her grandmother stood beside her, explaining in quiet tones how the lady in the picture had been hurt by someone who thought he would never be caught. "But the police found him anyway?" the girl asked. "Eventually," her grandmother replied. "It took a very long time, but they never gave up looking." The girl nodded solemnly, processing the concept that justice could take decades to arrive but would still be worth pursuing. She moved on to read about other solved cold cases, each one representing families who had endured years of uncertainty before finally receiving answers. Detective Santos attended the exhibit's opening, standing quietly in the back of the room as community members learned about the investigative techniques that had cracked Bay Shore's most notorious unsolved crime. Several visitors approached her with questions about cold case work, expressing amazement at the persistence required to solve mysteries that spanned multiple decades. "How many cases like this are still waiting to be solved?" asked a middle-aged man, whose own sister had been murdered in 1995. "Thousands," Santos replied honestly. "But every year, technology improves, and more cases find resolution. Your sister's case could be next." The exhibit would run for 3 months, introducing Bay Shore residents to the scientific innovations that had finally brought peace to their community. But more importantly, it would inspire other families dealing with unsolved crimes to maintain hope that their own answers might someday emerge from advancing forensic techniques. Near the exit, visitors could sign a book of remembrance for Edna and other victims whose cases had been featured in the display. The pages filled quickly with messages of sympathy, admiration for the investigators' persistence, and gratitude that science could reach across decades to deliver truth and closure. As people filed out into the autumn evening, they carried with them a new understanding of how justice worked slowly, sometimes, but inexorably, like water wearing away stone, until truth finally emerged. The first snowfall of winter 2023 arrived early, blanketing Bay Shore in pristine white that transformed familiar landscapes into something peaceful and new. From her kitchen window, Edna's daughter watched the flakes accumulate on the porch steps where her mother used to sit with morning coffee, reading the newspaper and waving to neighbors as they started their days. Snow had been falling. The night before Edna's funeral in April 2001, an unseasonable storm that seemed to mirror the community's disbelief that such violence could visit their quiet streets. Now, as winter officially began, the daughter found beauty rather than pain in the memory of that earlier snowfall. The house on Elm Street where her mother had died stood 3 blocks away, its current owners having decorated the porch with tasteful holiday lights that glowed warmly through the falling snow. The memorial garden planted in Edna's honor had grown throughout the summer and fall, creating a small space of peace where once there had been only the shadow of tragedy. Life in Bay Shore moved forward with the natural rhythm of seasons and generations. Children who had been born after 2001 played in the snow without any knowledge of the fear their parents had once carried. New families moved into the neighborhood, attracted by its reputation for safety and community spirit, qualities that had been tested by murder but ultimately proven stronger than violence. The daughter's own grandchildren built a snowman in her backyard, their laughter carrying on the winter air like music. They would grow up knowing their great-grandmother through stories and photographs rather than personal memories, but they would understand that she had been loved and was still remembered by people whose lives she had touched. Detective Santos drove past the Elm Street house during her evening patrol, noting the peaceful scene of snow-covered lawns and glowing windows. The investigation that had consumed 11 years of her career was finally complete, filed away in the basement archives where solved cases rested in well-deserved peace. The genetic genealogy success had led to breakthrough advances in other cold cases throughout Suffolk County. Technology that had seemed like science fiction in 2001 was now routine procedure, giving hope to families who had waited years or decades for answers about their murdered loved ones. As darkness fell over Bay Shore, porch lights began flickering on throughout the neighborhood, small beacons of warmth and safety that pushed back against the winter night. The light at 42 Elm Street glowed steadily, no longer marking a crime scene but simply welcoming anyone who might need guidance through the darkness. Snow continued falling as the town settled into winter quiet, covering the streets where Edna Schubert had once walked with friends and neighbors who loved her. The white blanket was clean and untouched, like a page waiting for new stories to be written, stories of healing, hope, and the enduring power of truth to triumph over evil, no matter how long that triumph might take to arrive. In death as in life, Edna remained part of her community's story, her memory preserved not in tragedy but in the love and determination that had finally brought her justice.